very warm welcome to you all on this very happy occasion. First of all, a very special welcome to Greg, our honoratus for this ceremony, and also a very warm welcome to his wife Adrian and members of the Sterling and Dumas families. I wish to welcome all the scholars who are joining in North America and throughout the globe, with a special welcome for board members of the Studia Philonica Annual and the Philo of Alexandria Commentary Series. I wish also to welcome former and present students of Greg. A warm welcome also to members of faculty and staff of Yale Divinity School, where Greg is located, and in general, a most warm welcome to all the friends and colleagues of Greg who are joining us for this special event. For a long time, I and others have felt that it would be highly appropriate for us to adopt one of academia's loveliest customs and present Greg with a collection of essays in the form of a Festschrift. And for this purpose, with the help of SBL Press, we were able to use the Studia Philonica Annual as a most fitting vehicle for the volume. As many of you know, Festschrifts are often linked to the milestone of a special birthday. Well, Greg turned 65 on the 21st of November 2019, a day or two before the SBL meeting in San Diego. Now, for various reasons, we weren't able to get the volume ready for that date, so we decided to move it to the meeting in Boston a year later. But fate intervened in a way that no one could have possibly imagined. The world was struck by the COVID pandemic. This meant also that we couldn't get the volume finalized in time for publication before the meeting in Boston. Not only some of the contributors, but also the publisher were held up. But now it's ready. And I and everyone associated with the project are absolutely delighted that we can honor Greg in this way. Not being able to hand it to him in person at the meeting is, of course, a great pity. But it has to be said that there are considerable advantages in doing a presentation by Zoom, for it allows friends and admirers of Greg throughout the entire world to join in. And I've already heard people say that informally now. Our speakers will say more, but let me say at the outset that no one, even the most austere Calvinist, is going to dispute that Greg fully deserves this recognition of his many contributions to scholarship. By means of this Festschrift, we salute his scholarly work on Josephus, on the New Testament, and above all on Philo, on whom Greg has written more than 60 articles, and you can see that all in the bibliography in the book. We also wish to recognize his editorial work, especially for the annual and for the commentary series, but also on many other occasions. And there is all his organizational work that he's done on behalf of Philonic and other studies, including his encouragement of others, and especially younger scholars, as they establish themselves in the academy. Greg, we are deeply indebted to you, and we want to express our thanks with this volume that you are about to receive. First, you're going to hear more about Greg and all the things he has done from our three speakers. Then we will have the presentation of the volume, which we are going to be doing in a special way. Greg will respond then with some words of his own, and to wrap up, we'll be able to have some informal conversation. But before I introduce our speakers, it remains for me to express my thanks to a long list of people who have assisted in this project. First, I want to thank my co-editor, Michael Cover. Michael is our book review editor, and this is the first time that he has co-edited the whole annual. Michael has a great eye for detail, but also for the bigger picture. It's been great to work on this together, bouncing ideas and issues off each other. Many thanks to you, Michael. May I express my gratitude, my very warm gratitude to our team of contributors who, under sometimes difficult circumstances, have prepared an exciting array of papers. At this moment, I have to mention that there were a number of invitees who couldn't complete their promised pieces because of circumstances, especially problems of library access. But here I want to make a special mention of our late and most lamented colleague, Tom Tobin. I was discussing his contribution with him just a week before his untimely passing. On a brighter note, warmest thanks to SBL Press, who made the project possible through their support and facilitation of the public in which it appears. Both Bob Buller and Nicole Tilford send their apologies for this session, and Bob asked me to read out the following message, I quote: "On behalf of SBL Press, I wish to congratulate Greg on the occasion of receiving this well-deserved honour and to thank him for his many contributions to the press and the society. I think first of Greg's tireless work with David Runia to edit the Studia Philonica Annual every year since 1999. But I am also grateful for Greg's service on the JBL editorial board, for his editing of the volume of David Winston's collected essays, and for his authoring of essays, articles, and reviews for various of our publications. We look forward to Greg's continued contributions to the press and society in the years to come. Thank you for this, Bob." Back to my thanks. I'd like to also warmly thank our student proofreaders, Chris Atkins and Awana Capatina, who read through the entire work. And also, I'd like to thank my wife, Goni, who's sitting behind me, for her tireless work in typesetting the volume. Warmest thanks to the YDS staff who helped in so many ways: Elaine Ranciato, Greg's EA, and Brock Harmon, his Associate Director of Communications. Also, my thanks to the Yale faculty who offered their assistance, John Collins and Harry Attridge. And last, but most certainly not least, my warm thanks to Adrian for all her support and assistance with this project. Thank you. May I now introduce our first speaker, Ellen Birnbaum, who will speak on behalf of Philo scholars and especially the group that meets at the SBL meeting every year. Ellen.
It's great to see everyone, especially on this occasion. And it's a pleasure and a privilege to say some words in honor of you, Greg. I first met Greg in 1986 at a session of the Philo of Alexandria group at the SBL meeting in Atlanta. The group was then led by Earl Hilgert, and Greg became the chair in 1991. For some 8 years, he organized very stimulating programs of usually 2 sessions, each focused on issues central to the field, such as whether Philo was a Middle Platonist. As far as I'm aware, Greg did this single-handedly. Those of us who have served as program unit chairs know the effort that it takes to come up with ideas for sessions and to corral appropriate and willing presenters. This was all the more true then when we didn't have co-chairs or steering committees. I myself had little to do with the planning, but Greg once told me that I was very good at thanking him for his efforts. One year, he asked me to present the results of my dissertation, and this marked for me a new level of participation. In 1995, Greg established the Philo of Alexandria Commentary Series, or PAX. The series, whose goal is to make Philo's works accessible to specialists and non-specialists alike, added a new dimension and purpose to our SBL meetings. Thereafter, alongside the thematic sessions, at least one panel at most meetings was and continues to be devoted to helping PAX editors prepare their individual volumes. After establishing this template for the Philo seminar programs, Greg continues to offer invaluable guidance about its research directions, session topics, and speakers. Often, papers from these sessions later appear in the Studia Philonica Annual, which Greg co-edits. For all of these contributions and more, Philo scholars from around the world are deeply in his debt. As some of you know, John Dillon and I recently published our co-edited Pax volume on Philo's On the Life of Abraham. To give you an idea of how enormously helpful Greg was as the series general editor, I'd like to share some of our experiences. To begin, Greg facilitated the collaboration between John and myself, made it possible for us to apply through Yale for a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, served as project director for the grant when it was awarded, offered editorial and substantive advice throughout, and was very supportive of me personally through a variety of situations. For several reasons, as John and I composed our draft, it had been easier for us to use transliterations instead of the Greek font. Although Greg and I had discussed various options about who would enter the Greek for these transliterations in the final copy, amazingly, he ended up doing this himself, something that John and I never expected. It was one thing to figure out what Philo meant by describing Abraham as an unwritten law, but when John and I were nearly finished with the manuscript, we had to review our text for stylistic consistency, to bring into accord our American and Irish usages, and to make our text conform to the latest SBL Handbook of Style requirements, some of which had changed over the years that we worked together. I drew up a list of questions about matters like commas, semicolons, capitalizations, pronouns, quotation marks, italics, and other details, and then contacted Greg's very helpful assistant, Elaine Rancietto, to make a phone appointment with him. As we all know, Greg is very busy. It turned out that the best time for us to speak was as he was being driven to the airport on his way to Germany. If I were traveling to Germany, I'm quite sure I wouldn't want to spend my trip to the airport discussing commas and semicolons. But since this was the available time, Greg and I had an extended conversation about what had begun to feel like insurmountable problems, and we went through them all. When we finished speaking, I told Greg that although I'd been a little skeptical that we'd be able to get through my list, I now felt great relief and optimism that it would be possible to complete the volume. In reply, he commented, "Well, you know, this isn't my first rodeo." Having never heard this expression before, after we hung up, I began to think of wide open spaces in the American West with bucking broncos, cowboys, and lassos. Soon, though, I turned my attention to all the activities that Greg has directed, including his editing of all the other Pax volumes, his co-editing of the Studia Philonica Annual, his leadership of the SBL Philo Group, and many other academic projects and publications, all of which are described and celebrated in the volume that we're happily presenting today. So, Greg, let me say how honored and pleased I am to have been part of at least some of the rodeos that you've coordinated. With great respect and gratitude for your friendship and guidance, I know that I speak for all of us in wishing you many more successful rodeos and other fulfilling projects in the years to come, together with good health and much happiness.
Thank you so much, Ellen, and Greg will get the chance to respond to that. But let me now introduce our second speaker, Michael Cover, co-editor of the volume, and he'll be speaking on behalf of Greg's students. Michael.
Great. All right. David has asked me to speak for a few minutes, not as co-editor of the Festschrift, but as one of Greg's students and mentees, and I am overwhelmed by the honor to do so. There is no other scholar who has had so large and positive an impact on my own academic career as Greg Sterling, and I'm sure many on this call would say as much as well. I owe Greg a debt of gratitude that I am not able to repay. But in these brief comments, I want to speak about Greg's teaching during the Notre Dame years when I knew him, and the way he modeled several pedagogical virtues: the importance of memory in teaching and scholarship, the inclusion of doctoral students in one's own research, the goods of forming communities of scholars outside the classroom, and the importance of service. I'll begin with my first memory of Greg. No prospective student applying to the CJA program at the University of Notre Dame in the mid to late aughts could long have remained ignorant of who Greg Sterling was. In addition to his international reputation in the fields of Judaism and the New Testament, his name had also achieved a kind of household fame at the school. I remember in my first year as a doctoral student at a cocktail party for applicants during Notre Dame's long interview weekend, a potential student sidled up to me nervously, looked starstruck across the room, and whispered, "There's Greg Sterling." "Yes," I replied to him, "let's go talk to him." With this perspective, didn't know, but what I had learned in my first semester was that for all Greg's erudition, accomplishment, and importance, there was no one easier to talk to. The ensuing conversation was likewise memorable. After some politenesses about geographical origins, the prospective student asked Greg something about De Opificio Mundi. Greg smiled and said, "Let's go through what Philo says in that treatise," and proceeded to work chapter by chapter through its contents by memory. For Greg, as I learned in later years, memory was not just a party trick. It was foundational to the habitus of his academic mind. Later in his doctoral seminars, like the one he offered on the fragments of Philo's Hypothetica, Greg would encourage us to read a text not once, but 3 or 4 times until we had committed its contents to memory. The purpose was to build up a thesaurus of sorts to serve us in later years. The second way that Greg mentored his students was by including them in his own research. This was especially on display for me when in that same doctoral seminar on the Hypothetica, Greg offered the chance to publish the most original and convincing papers, pending peer review, in a special section of the Studia Philaunica Annual. Greg was himself at this time working on the Hypothetica, and it was clear that he valued our input as colleagues, inexperienced as we might be. The process served as a kind of grand welcome to the field, one that encouraged us, but also ennobled us. For Dulcinea Bosenberg, Horacio Vela, and myself, it also became the opportunity for our first publications. The third way that Greg mentored his students was through the formation of extracurricular communities of scholarship. I experienced this most memorably in Greg's convening the Coptic Reading Group at Notre Dame. Having led us through the rudiments of Lambden's grammar, Greg continued to convene further informal reading sessions in his 4th floor dean's office beneath the gilded rotunda of Notre Dame's famous Golden Dome. I remember, among other things, reading the Gospel of Judas with Peter Jeffrey and discussing various reflections of Christian liturgy in that text. If Greg's doctoral seminars gave students a ground floor in the field, the Coptic Reading Group and similar seminars, which were open to all, invited us to an upper room or Oberseminar. The fourth and final way that Greg mentored his students was through serving as their doctoral directors. And this is, as I am still learning, having now co-advised 4 doctoral dissertations and beginning my first flight as a solo advisor, this is a very deep act of service which requires faith, patience, and above all time, as one walks with students through the biggest project of their lives to date. By the tally of Sharon Price at Notre Dame, during his time at the university, Greg directed 9 doctoral dissertations and served as board member and mentor of countless others. To each of us whom Greg directed, he offered hours of his time, patiently enduring our half-formed ideas and midwifing our better thoughts toward projects whose futures we couldn't quite yet see. Greg's doctorandum and their dissertation titles are as follows in chronological order, and my apologies if I have any of these details wrong. I think I've got them all correct. 2004, Ron Cox, By the Same Word, The Intersection of Cosmology and Soteriology in Hellenistic Judaism, Early Christianity and Gnosticism in the Light of Middle Platonic Intermediary Doctrine. 2007, Kindy Fremer DeLong, Surprised by God, Praise Responses in the Narrative of Luke Acts. 2008, Jack Conroy, The Wages of Sin is Death, The Death of the Soul in Greek, Second Temple Jewish, and Early Christian Authors. David George, 2009, Jesus' Lack of Emotion in Luke, The Lucan Redactions in Light of the Hellenistic Philosophers. Jae-Chun Cho, 2013, Philo Romaios, The Portraits of Herod Agrippa II by Josephus and Luke. Michael Cover, 2013, Lifting the Veil, 2 Corinthians 3, 7 through 18, in light of Jewish homiletic and commentary traditions. 2015, Michael Francis, Borderline Bad, Philo of Alexandria on the distinction between voluntary and involuntary sin. 2017, Brian Young Lee, Members of Christ, Reevaluating the Significance of Stoic Language and the Unity of Paul's Arguments in 1 Corinthians. 2017, Horacio Vela, The Inner Human Being, The Transformation of a Platonic Metaphor in Ancient Judaism and Early Christianity. Those who know Greg will recognize in these titles not just topics that might be of passing interest to him, but reflections of his own scholarship, spermatikoi logoi, if you like, or chips off the old logos. Those of us fortunate enough to count ourselves among Greg's academic children remember well how much of himself he gave to each of our projects, even as we made them our own. It's important to note that the last 5 of these dissertations, including my own, Greg finished while advising after his move to New Haven. Some scholars in Greg's situation, knowing the full weight of responsibility that awaited him in the role of YDS Dean, might have dropped these dissertations, but Greg did not. I'd like to close briefly by recounting 4 pieces of scholarly advice that Greg gave me, both as a student and as his mentee in later years, which I have collected into a kind of Sterling's Mishnah. I have often found them helpful and have passed them on to my own students. Number 1, when you are tired at night, if you're too tired at night to write, read Greek. Just place your finger on the line like this and read until you can't. If you're reading from a lobe, cover up the English. Number 2, there are 2 kinds of scholars, lumpers and splitters, those who seek new unities and those who break apart the errors of the past. Know yourself and draw on both kinds. Number 3, the first time you write the argument, you write it for yourself. The second time, you write it for others. And number 4, learn to write out, to articulate the relevance of your highly technical subject to the wider public, and thus to serve the common weal. Now, I'm not claiming that these are the ipsissima verba of Greg, nor that they have not perhaps been amplified by some of his more excitable colleagues and disciples. I offer them here to Greg as a token of my thanks and a proof of the lasting impact he has had on me, not just as a scholar, but as a teacher and as a person. On behalf of those of us who, in the spirit of Philo's Abraham, have made progress by Greg's instruction, thank you. Evcharisto.
Thank you very much, Michael, for that wonderful tribute. And now I call on Greg's colleague at YDS, John Collins, to introduce the volume to us. John, over to you.
Greg's work has always had 2 poles, Hellenistic Judaism and the New Testament. His dissertation focused on Josephus and Luke Acts, while also taking other Hellenistic Jewish writings into account. He has returned to Josephus sporadically, most recently in a volume on traditions about the Golden Calf in 2019, but his preferred exponent of Hellenistic Judaism has undoubtedly been Philo. Greg has had a particular interest in the reception of Philo in early Christianity, but he has certainly never relegated Philo to New Testament backgrounds. His primary interest has always been in the thought of Philo in its own right and its distinctive blending of Greek philosophy and Jewish scripture. It is appropriate then that all 12 essays in this volume deal with Philo in one way or another. 7 of the 12 deal with aspects of Philo's thought in its Jewish context. Ellen Birnbaum discusses Philo's treatment of Genesis. I discuss love of neighbor in Hellenistic era Judaism, picking up at an essay Greg wrote on the question of a common ethic in Hellenistic Judaism in a volume we edited together on sapiential perspectives on the Dead Sea Scrolls. Michael Cover reviews the confessional passages in Philo that reveal something of his self-understanding. Jan Willem van Henten is the only contributor to include Josephus in his purview, but also Philo in his essay on the meaning of Threskeia. Andrew McGowan writes on Philo's treatment of sacrifice. James Royce on overlooked classical references in Philo, and David Runia brings the volume to an upbeat end with an essay on the virtue of hope in Philo. The remaining 5 essays explore points of contact between Philo and the New Testament. One is an overview by Carl Holliday, who suggests that some references to Philo should be included in Nestle Aland. One by Harry Attridge compares educational principles in Philo and the Fourth Gospel. The remaining 3 deal with points of contact with Philo in the Pauline epistles. Adela Yarbrough Collins discusses a shared tradition about water from the rock. Karl Wilhelm Niebuhr discusses Paul's treatment of Adam's sin and the origin of death in light of a broad range of Hellenistic texts, including Philo. And Mara Niehoff brings Philo into conversation with Paul's letter to the Galatians on the topics of circumcision and covenant. We were deprived of another contribution, most probably on Philo and Paul, by the untimely death of Tom Tobin, to whom Greg pays tribute in the news and notes section of this volume. Greg, we hope you enjoy these essays and find them a worthy reflection of your scholarly interests.
Thank you very much, John. And now we're moving towards the climax of this event. Harry Attridge, Greg's predecessor as Dean at YDS, can I now call on you to make the presentation?
Thank you, David. It's a distinct pleasure to be able to hand this volume to Greg, even if that handoff is virtual. This volume is a testimony to and an expression of gratitude for the number of things that people have already called our attention to. That is Greg's superb scholarship, his service to his colleagues, his mentorship of students, and his leadership in the academic world. It's a distinct pleasure for me to present this volume because I've known Greg since he started at the University of Notre Dame. I was in fact on the committee that hired him. And then I was there to greet him when he came to succeed me as Dean of Yale Divinity School. And it's been my pleasure to watch him in that capacity during the last 8 years, as he's continued to do his splendid work, both as a scholar and as an academic leader. So it is my great pleasure to put his book into Greg's hands. And I'm going to do this magically. I have this book here nicely wrapped, and I'm going to put it into hyperspace, and it'll come out on the other side. Oh, it lost its color, but there it is. Greg, thank you for your scholarship. Thank you for your service.
I want to say from the bottom of my heart, thank you to everyone for making this possible. I would say I'm speechless, but you know that deans are never without words. So I do want to say a few things. I've been involved in, I think, 15 different Festschriften. I've edited or co-edited 4, and I've contributed to at least 11 more. Maybe I've missed some. but I've never thought about what it would mean to receive a Festschrift until today. So I'll share 3 reflections. My initial reaction is, I feel old. Young scholars don't receive Festschriften, only people approaching the end of their career. And forgive me, but my studies of Josephus and the ancient Roman world kept coming back to me. That is one statement. Vespasian, who is just a few years older than I am right now, when he became ill and exclaimed, at least according to Suetonius, he said, "Why, puto Deus fio?" Oh no, I think I'm becoming a god. In other words, I'm dying. And while a dean has no illusions of a posthumous apotheosis at all, I share with Vespasian the desire to remain in this corporeal flesh for a good number of years and to be productive. My second reaction is that Festschriften make us keenly aware that scholarship is not an isolated act. That is, scholarship is communal. We spend most of our lives sitting at a desk by ourselves, or maybe in a library, and yet we are never alone, nor do we accomplish our work alone. Our teachers leave an indelible stamp on us. For me, these include in particular John Donahue, David Winston, and Eric Gruen. John taught me that the New Testament need not be divorced from the study of theology. David introduced me to the world of Philo of Alexandria and set an incredibly high standard for scholarship. Eric made me think carefully about argumentation and insisted that I form my own arguments. In fact, he once quipped to me, "You're just like my own children. You listen politely, and then you go ahead and do what you want to do anyway." Well, I haven't always agreed with my teachers, but I think that's a healthy thing. I am, however, indebted to them in ways that I can never repay, not only to these 3, but to many others, Ann Wire, for example. I sometimes, in thinking about my own life, reflected that I basically followed Harry Attridge and John and Adela Collins around the United States. And this is in part due to their own agency. Harry was, as he just said, on the committee who hired me at Notre Dame and then served as my dean at Notre Dame and as my official mentor while I was still an untenured professor. John, who was not only a mentor to me at Notre Dame and Adela, but John was the chair of the search committee when I came to Yale. My career would not be what it has been without the friendship of these 3 people. From the warm welcomes in your home when I first arrived at Notre Dame all those years ago, until the present, thank you. I'm deeply indebted. And I sometimes think it's really strange how life works. I had no idea that one day I would be your dean, but God has a sense of humor in all of this. There are others who have been especially important to me, senior scholars, and there are so many. I saw the faces of people I've known for 30 years or more on the screen, and a flood of memories came back. I will mention just 2, but they're by no means alone. I could mention many, many more. But I met Abe Malherbe when I was a doctoral student and still remember his lecture on the pastorals that he gave. This was in Berkeley. we maintained contact and a good friendship. And one of my great regrets was that when I moved to Yale, I had anticipated being able to visit with Abe on a regular basis, but he died suddenly and unexpectedly within months of our arrival. Another person who comes from my own religious tradition is Carl Holliday. I first met Carl in Pittsburgh at an ATS sponsored program for Lilly Fellows. I was a Lilly Fellow that year. I didn't know that he'd been a reader of my work on historiography and self-definition for Brill, but I later learned that. But our paths have continually crossed in our lives, and we've done a good number of things together. Those bonds became very close friendships, and Abe and Phyllis and Carl and Donna and Adrian and I, for a good number of years, had a tradition to get together once a year at a conference and have dinner. Memories that are very important to me. We also have peers who shape us. The first SBL meeting that I ever attended was in Anaheim, California. I met a large number of Philonists at that meeting, but none was more important to me than a European/Australian postdoc who was attending his first annual meeting. Neither of us could imagine the courses our lives would take. But from that session on the Quaestiones et Solutiones, we developed a friendship that has made us collaborators now for more than 28 years. David, I am deeply grateful for our friendship and our partnership and all of the ventures that we've done. And both Adrian and I cherish our friendship with you and Ghani. Another Philonist I met at Anaheim was Earl Hilkert. And when I joined the faculty at Notre Dame a couple of years later, I learned that Earl was retiring from McCormick Theological Seminary, and that the Philo of Alexandria group was going to simply fold and disappear. So I drove over to Chicago and met Earl for lunch and asked him about this. Earl was confident that SBL would not renew the Philo seminar, but with youthful bravado, I said, "Well, do you mind if I try?" And he said, "No, here are the records, good luck." And one might say the rest is history from that point on. But I've cherished the many friendships that have been formed in this program unit. It's never been the largest unit. It never will be the largest unit in SBL. But it has always been a group of exceptionally talented people who have a common commitment, who can disagree with one another in a session, and then go have a joyful dinner with one another in real bonds of friendship. For me, that's what scholarship is about, or should be about. So for longstanding friends like Annavies Vandenhoek and Ellen, thank you so much for what you said. Ellen, who ran the unit for a good number of years herself. For our dear friend of blessed memory, David Hay and Tom Tobin. For Mara Niehoff, Jim Royce, Abraham Tarian, on. But for all of you, I say thank you so much. I also want to thank the students with whom I've had the pleasure of working, some in early Christianity, some in Second Temple Judaism. But I've learned a great deal from you, and I appreciate all that you have taught me. I think one of the challenges that all of us face and obligations as scholars is to form scholars who will not only continue the work of our academic disciplines, but will transform them. And so Mike, Michael, Ron and Kendi and Horatio and a good number of others, you now have the relationship with me that I had with Eric. And I ask you only to disagree politely. But I wish you the best, and I celebrate all that you have accomplished and all that you will accomplish. I have never lived alone. I have a family that has been very supportive of me. For my brother and sister, who I think are on this call, for my children, and I might mention that today is my eldest daughter, Audra's birthday. She's a professor at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. I think she's probably watching. So happy birthday, Audra. I'm very proud of you. For Amber and for Joe and for Lee, all of you have enriched my life immensely. But above all, I want to thank Adrian. She is my other half. She made it possible for me to serve as a full-time administrator in 2 different universities and to maintain what she calls my hobby, meaning my scholarship. And although she has spent more time alone than she should have to spend alone, when my work weeks have run into 7-day, long day weeks, which they often do, she has always been there as a source of joy to me, and I cherish that. I've been very fortunate in my life. I've worked at 2 of the world's great universities. They've enabled me to ask how ancient Jews and Christians interacted with the larger world and yet maintain their own identities, a question that has fascinated me all of my life. For the last 20 years, I've been a full-time administrator. I served as a dean because I thought I could help more people in this capacity than if I remained a scholar and didn't serve. Sometimes people say, well, do you have any regrets? I wish that I would have published more books, in all honesty, but I don't regret my choices. They were the right decisions for me. At the same time, I have often said to a student who's asked me about this, I used to do what I love to do, but as a dean, I earn my living. And every dean, Harry, knows that and what that means all too well. But I never have lost my love of scholarship. I didn't enter the academy to be a dean, I entered to be a scholar. And I'm touched beyond words that you have honored me as a scholar with this book. Thank you all.
Thank you, Greg, so much for your words. You were moved to pronounce them. We could see that. And we were moved to listen to them and to hear you speak about your career and some of the things that you think about all those years that you've been engaged as a student, as a scholar, as a leader, and I could go on. I just want to add one more thing before we have an open conversation, and that is to thank you most warmly from the depths of my heart for your friendship that we've had together. This book that you've received today is one more thing that cements that friendship that we've had. It's to use a very common phrase, it's a token of that friendship. But please accept it in that spirit from the friendship I've had with you and the friendship that you've had and still have with so many others in the academy and outside that. So thank you again from all of us.
Thank you, David. I'm going to open it now, if I may.
Please, please, please.
I will enjoy reading this and I will savor every essay. I'll try to write each of you a response, not as an editor, but just as a friend to say thank you. But I'm deeply touched. These are not things you think about when you start, but thank you from the bottom of my heart.
This has been a wonderful occasion for all of us, for Philo studies, for scholarship in general. And I just repeat the words of so many people. Greg, thank you for all that you've done. And we wish you still many years of productivity, particularly in scholarship and in also so many other ways. Thank you everyone for participating. Thank you to Elaine and Brock for facilitating all of this. I say goodbye to you all.